The Descent of a Man, with apologies to Darwin. Once atop the mountain, I asked her to do a topless fashion shoot, play acting of a sort which had never occurred to me with any other woman. I did not question why such a strange request gurgled, involuntarily and uneasily, out of my throat. It was a bizarre and thoroughly uncharacteristic request for me, yet one that was utterly in line with the manufactured theatrical hypocrisy that had been choking my better instincts since the beginning of this tacky soap opera, this god-awful, screechy melodrama that I seemed to have somehow signed on to since those very first purple wannabe Emily Bronte letters. A melodrama in which one of the protagonists spoke with a wild, repetitive, rehearsed, and disingenuous exuberance, signifying and evoking nothing other than a vague dread in my bowels, which I had yet to understand. This nebulous terror was not, at least yet, of being seduced by some malevolent harpy who hid her fangs and agendas even from herself. The worry was that I was being bewitched and narcotized by my own stupidity. The stuff of tragedy? No, of farce. She obliged. I knew she would. It was clearly marked in both our scripts, after all. The part of me that knew she would oblige was the very same part which knew full well that I should turn tail and bolt down the mountain, like a horror-struck fawn fleeing a ravenous wolf. She was lovely, or so most men would claim. My mind appreciated, in quotes, her beauty, yes, but only in the manner of a schoolboy who has been instructed by an overtired and underpaid high school teacher in all the orthodox reasons one should declare the Pietà a masterpiece. Off came the blouse, and then that blouse was predictably swung around in a manner doubtless cribbed from some two-bit actress starring in some noxious rom-com. Glazed watching with a hint of disbelief and disgust, followed by more cringeworthy posing. I did my best to look as if I were entranced, then looked away. I forced a disingenuous smile, then grabbed a camera with which to hide my face, which must have been dripping full of an unambiguous duplicity any normal woman would have recognized. The lake was obscured in the distance by trees and mist. The silence was eerie, threatening, full of a wisdom it knew full well, but which it took care to hide, and which manifested only in a vague, uncanny atmosphere of menace. Oh, for some sound, any sound. Of nature, of creature, of branches crashing to the ground, of wind whistling through those branches ominously or sweetly. It mattered not. Of some human, any human, a backpacking pair of hippies, a buzzsaw in the distance, a maniacal serial killer asking for a light. Anything to mask the silence screaming in my brain that this was wrong, this was dangerous, that I must get the fuck away. And when it began to become apparent that no such diversion was to be forthcoming, I began to yearn for some mindless, lewd, gnawing in my gut sufficient to overcome my hesitation and wish to flee, some bestial, overwhelming urge to fuck her. To fuck her or not to fuck her, that was clearly the question. Whether 'tis nobler to impale oneself on a harpoon, play my part in this obviously manufactured travesty, or to flee, to fuck, and surely die as a result, or to cut and run before the trap had fully closed, and I was even more helpless, more lethargic, indifferent, frozen watching. And embarrassment for her? She was ridiculous. Did she not realize how ridiculous she was? I had become a rock with eyes, which watched my mouth move in shock and disbelief, a mouth of which it had had no previous awareness. I watched it utter words of hollow, hypocritical praise, all the while desperately wishing to be rock, and only rock, once again. Words that anyone with a modicum of intuition would have recognized as forged and counterfeit. Words inviting the catastrophe to come. There was finally the relief of turning around, of coming down the mountain, of hearing a buck in the distance staking out its territory with a mangled cry, of wishing I were he. The longing when rounding a turn and nearing a cliff to ditch my part in this godforsaken movie. On our way down, we arrived at what looked like a beaver pond, The air was still. My sneakers were sopping wet from the sinkhole I had stepped in. Dusk. Bats. Squeals from creatures known and unknown. In the air. In the trees. In the pond. The sound of creaking branches in the distance. Sounds, finally. Sounds to compete with the dread-filled voices in my head. And suddenly, there he was. A beaver cutting a soundless swath through the pond, his eyes above water. Either a beaver, a gentle swimming dog, or perhaps a stalking serpent. He slapped the water with his tail, signifying everything. Everything I knew, but couldn't yet admit to myself or act upon. There was a sensibleness in him which I searched for in vain within myself. We are fools, interlopers, suffocating in our mindless internal chatter, which so rarely tells us the truth, we can't hear our own lives dropping to the forest floor, much less a pin. There he was. Seemingly all-knowing, there it was. The stillness at the center of everything. I was in it. The effortless rightness and profundity of the stars, the night sky, the croaking frogs. I was still beside her, but light years distant, everything that is of any worth within me had abandoned her and was now only here and in this moment. I could have died then, knowing that moment. The problem was that I would forget it and be unable to die as a result. The voice in my head now said, nay, demanded, tarry. And so we did. Alone. At last. I was finally alone, yet together in her mind, which seemed to not at all register my absence. For an hour? For a lifetime? When she spoke, it became an eternity. For all the wrong reasons. When we returned, I learned that it was as I had already been repeatedly taught to expect and had finally grasped it was to be. And at that moment, in my mind's ear, I heard my own voice, as clearly and as brutally honest as was possible at that time, given its still limited information. So don't sleep next to me after we fuck. I understand. No problem. Because outside this cabin, there's a meteor shower and the sky is laughing. Why would I possibly worry about what is to come, about who you are, about what you want, about what you are planning, without even realizing that you are planning it? And dear God, please stop with all those laughably ludicrous, cliched, studied, faux seductive looks and moves. They are absurd, preposterous. Why would I endure a round of overly serious sex, full of phony protestations, slavishly over-rehearsed sighs and facial expressions, just for the sake of a dopey little orgasm? The feeblest of payoffs for what I would be forced to endure in order to arrive at it? Why? When comets are racing through empty space and stars are exploding in the heavens? Listen, fool, to the crickets, to the night's hum, its orgiastic enveloping song, to its dark, compelling invitation to forget, to its delicious stupor. Our bodies could then come together in what you are bound to call an exploding supernova, not long after some all-important cosmos-shattering event that proclaims our love for all eternity. Some bit of purple nonsense you've cribbed from the cheesy hokum you imbibe constantly, all that shit you constantly say can't possibly mean, and know is secondhand. Have you noticed? Once having declared such gibberish, what happens next? Almost invariably, to both of us? To absolutely everyone after they fuck? That we have to take a piss, perhaps stub our little toe on the way to the bathroom, and begin to obsess upon whether it's broken or not? That we're assaulted by the vile stench of sweat and spittle, suddenly embarrassed and disgusted by our bodies, and overwhelmed by post-coital depression? But then again, as Galen said, every animal is sad after coitus except the human female and the rooster. So perhaps that is unlikely. Yet there is also Spinoza, whom you would dismiss, along with every other philosopher, because you misread a chapter or two of Wittgenstein in college, and use him as an excuse whenever you don't want to deal with any challenging or troubling thoughts. Apparently everything is mere wordplay until you're attempting to manipulate me through their use. Is this wordplay? After the enjoyment of sensual pleasure is past, the greatest sadness follows. Or Schopenhauer's maxim, directly after copulation, the devil's laughter is heard. I know perfectly well what would be more than likely to happen were we to fuck now, and why. And with a certainty far greater than ordinarily, were I to be lying next to, much less inside of you, death, desiccation, and the abyss. All I want is to not be here, to not be anywhere at all, to exist at all, to be lost in the ecstasy of the night, in silence and oblivion. Not the awful silence that was hysterically screaming just a few hours ago, "Run, get away!" The silence that will carry me home to when and where I was not. The silence which held me in its loving arms before I was born, and to which I shall return. But of course, I said none of this. The fact was that I'd already folded like a house of cards in a tornado, and was soon to be dragged to a landfill, from whence I'd be eventually carted on a donkey, whipped and brutalized by this woman to do her bidding down a long, agonizing road to meet my destiny, to be incinerated alive in hell.